The Crooked River public boat ramp and parking lot at the end of Highway Spur 40 is situated adjacent to Elliott's Bluff. As you face the river, you are facing north. The East and Cumberland Island are to your right. Cabin Bluff is situated approximately 4.5 miles to the northeast. Harriet's Bluff is situated approximately 2.25 miles to the northwest. Wednesday, 5 October 1814 was a busy day for the Royal Navy. A flotilla off St. Catherine's Island comprised of HMS Lacedaemonian and 2 brigs attacked and captured the sloops Fox of Charleston and John of St. Mary's bound for Savannah. Later that day, boats from Lacedaemonian under Lieutenant Robert S. Maw attacked a southbound convoy that had just crossed St. Andrews Sound. The convoy had originated in Charleston and stopped briefly in Savannah. When attacked, the convoy was comprised of Bailey's schooner, Captain Chase's schooner, the schooner Hawk, and the schooner Jack-o'-lantern. All were laden with supplies for St. Mary's. 3 U.S. Navy gunboats sailed as escorts. After crossing St. Andrews Sound, Bailey's schooner Hawk and Jack-o'-lantern, under the protection of gunboat 160, anchored off Cabin Bluff. The 2 other gunboats were about 3 miles in advance of the group anchored at Cabin Bluff. Shortly after midnight, an American sentry announced the approach of enemy boats. Alarm! Moments later, out of the darkness, the Americans received a volley of musket fire. As quickly as the gun could be served, the 32-pounder of gunboat 160 returned fire, with terrible effect on the enemy. The shot swept the British boat fore and aft, mangling bodies and limbs. The British sheer force of numbers, consisting of 200 men and a sloop with a long gun and midship, overwhelmed the convoy. After a hotly contested struggle, the British suffered 4 killed, including the commander, and 22 wounded, including Lieutenant Howells of the Royal Marines and 2 midshipmen. The Americans suffered no fatalities and 2 wounded, but the British destroyed all 3 schooners and took gunboat 160 back to the frigate HMS Lacedaemonian as a prize. En route to Lacedaemonian, the British stranded 16 American seamen on a sandbar in St. Andrews Sound, a mile from Cumberland Island, with a flood tide. 1 seaman drowned, and another died of exhaustion. The hurricane season of 1813 was particularly dangerous, spreading destruction and misery throughout the eastern Caribbean, Leeward Islands, and U.S. southern coast. 3 weeks after the devastating hurricane of 27 August scoured the southern coast, a major tempest struck St. Mary's. A powerful storm approached from the Leeward Islands, pounding North Florida and South Georgia. Modern-day meteorologists have rated this hurricane as Category 3. The town of Fernandina on Amelia Island, to the immediate south of St. Mary's, suffered 28 houses blown down. In the harbor, every vessel save 1 brig was driven ashore. The brig had 5 anchors set and was dragged ashore by the storm. However, when the eye passed and the wind shifted, the vessel was dragged back out into the harbor. William Baldwin, surgeon aboard U.S. gunboat 168, rode the storm out at a friend's house in Fernandina. He returned home to St. Mary's on horseback. At times, his horse was in water up to the saddle. Upon his return, he found his family safe, but saw the shambles of his town. He remarked,
"The oldest inhabitants here observe that this gale has not been parallel since their memory, even in the land of hurricanes."
In addition to the commercial shipping, a privateer Enterprise, a U.S. revenue cutter, and 3 Navy gunboats sank. The Portuguese vessel Flor de Guadiana, formerly the Alexander Hamilton, was run hard aground and bilged on Cumberland Island, a total loss with her cargo of 900 bales of cotton. 6 gunboats were driven ashore, 4 near St. Mary's, 1 driven 3 miles on the Florida Marsh, and 1 on the marsh at Harriet's Bluff. 20 men drowned when gunboat 164 went down. The most remarkable story was that of gunboat 168. When the storm struck, gunboat 168 was anchored off Cumberland. Her draft prevented her from coming up the St. Mary's River past Point Peter. Looking for shelter, she made a run for the harbor at Fernandina and anchored above the town. At the height of the storm, gunboat 168 broke her anchor cable and was swept along with the 20-foot storm surge. Gunboat 168 was carried like a leaf on a pond. The storm drove the helpless gunboat 7 miles up Cumberland Sound over numerous low-lying islands and marshland, past Kings Bay and Elliott's Bluff. She finally came to rest on Harriet's Bluff, where she was a pitiful sight, lying on her side with her mast broken. A large labor force dug a channel from her place of rest in the marsh to the Crooked River, where she was refloated. Gunboat 168 was repaired and returned to service on the Georgia coast, where she would fire the last shot of the war in American waters against HMS Erebus on 16 March 1815. The fertile soil found in the bottomland among Camden County's rivers was most advantageous for agriculture. Fortunes were made growing sugarcane, rice, indigo, and cotton. Contrary to popular belief, the South enjoyed a healthy maritime tradition. It was an economic necessity. Numerous river craft were employed to bring the various agricultural products from the plantations to the port. St. Mary's loaded cargo from the smaller river craft onto the coastal trading schooners. These vessels engaged in the coastwise trade along the U.S. East Coast and Caribbean. Deeper draft ocean-going vessels engaged in trade with Europe. Among the early plantations of Camden County were Seagrove, Kings Bay, Gatehouse, The Anchorage, Harriet Bluff, Marion, New Canaan, Bellevue, Stafford, and Dungeness. The names of the plantation owners read like a who's who of Georgia. Among those names were Thomas King, Thomas Andrews, George Bailey, Archibald Clark, Charles and John Floyd, Philip Goodbread, William McNish, Samuel Parker, James Seagrove, Louisa Green Shaw, James Smith, and John Wood. The wealthiest landowner in Camden County at the time of the War of 1812 was John Houston McIntosh, with holdings in Florida and Georgia. Among his properties in Camden County, Georgia were The Refuge, Marion, and New Canaan. McIntosh's Kingsley plantation in Florida still stands. The Refuge on the north side of the Great Satilla River, not far from Woodbine, stood until 1970. New Canaan was situated on property within the Kings Bay U.S. Naval Submarine Base. One may see the tabby ruins of John Houston McIntosh's sugar mill on the present-day Georgia Highway Spur 40, across from the Stimson Gate of the Navy Base, not far from where his New Canaan plantation once stood. Built circa 1825, it was the first cattle-powered horizontal cane mill of its kind. In 1807, the slave trade was abolished within the British Empire. This action would have repercussions for American slave owners in ways they could not imagine at the time. During the War of 1812, the British sought the mutually beneficial relationship they enjoyed with the black population during the War of Independence. With a proclamation promising freedom, Royal Governor Dunmore of Virginia raised Lord Dunmore's Ethiopian Regiment, a regiment of black troops to fight against the Patriot forces. Many runaway slaves from southern states served with the German Hessen-Kassel and the Hessen-Hanau regiments. Although some blacks who fought for the British were returned to slavery after the war, many enjoyed their promised freedom. During the British occupation of Cumberland Island and environs, Rear Admiral Cockburn read a proclamation drafted by his superior, Vice Admiral Sir Alexander Cochrane, which was interpreted by many as an emancipation proclamation.
By the Honourable Sir Alexander Cochrane, KB, Vice Admiral of the Red and Commander-in-Chief of His Majesty's ships and vessels upon the North American station, a proclamation. Whereas it has been represented to me that many persons now resident in the United States have expressed a desire to withdraw therefrom with a view of entering into His Majesty's service or of being received as free settlers into some of His Majesty's colonies. This is therefore to give notice that all those who may be disposed to emigrate from the United States will, with their families, be received on board His Majesty's ships or vessels of war, or at the military posts that may be established upon or near the coast of the United States, when they will have their choice of either entering into His Majesty's sea or land force, or being sent as free settlers to the British possessions in North America or in the West Indies, where they will meet with all due encouragement. Given under my hand at Bermuda, Alexander Cochrane. God save the King.
Cockburn read the same proclamation during his fiery Chesapeake campaign. Of those slaves who responded, specifically those from counties of McIntosh, Glynn, and Camden, enlisted in the 4th, 5th, and 6th companies of the 3rd Battalion of Colonial and Royal Marines, were taken to Nova Scotia and settled in the community of Upper Hammond Plains. The names of 58 men from Camden County appear on the enlistment rolls in the 4th, 5th, and 6th companies of the 3rd Battalion Colonial Marines. The names of some men from Camden County appear on the rolls of the 2nd West India Regiment. The number of African American refugees who departed Georgia aboard British vessels in 1815 is not an exact figure. However, a post-war recapitulation places the number at 833 men, women, and children. At no time did the British proclamation make enlistment a requirement. Cochrane's proclamation extended to all persons in America who were dissatisfied with America or desired the protection of the British flag. Accordingly, many former slaves accepted Cochrane's proclamation and gained their freedom. The British emancipation raised numerous legal issues to be settled after the ratification of the Treaty of Ghent. Georgians, Virginians, and Marylanders wasted no time pressing this matter with their state and federal representatives. Less than a month after Coburn's departure from Cumberland, noted McIntosh County planter Thomas Spaulding left for Bermuda aboard gunboat 168 to address such issues with His Majesty's government. Due to the language of certain provisions of the Treaty of Ghent, the British, in some cases, were forced to rescind their promise of freedom, resulting in some refugees being returned to slavery. Thus, depending on one's interpretation of events, Rear Admiral Sir George Cockburn is perceived as a liberator hero or a duplicitous villain. For more information about the War of 1812, be sure to visit the National Park Service Cumberland Island National Seashore Museum, located at 129 Osborne Street.